Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about UI component testing using Jest and Storybook. So my name is DiegoHernandez. I'm a front-end developer at IBM. I'm also a grad student at DePaul studying software engineering. And I work in the IBM Security Business Unit, where we build cybersecurity products and software for large enterprise companies. And so this talk is based on my journey learning how to test code, and specifically UI code. When I first started working as a developer, I was building really small applications that were not very mission critical, so it really wasn't a thing that I worried about. But then I joined IBM, and we work on much larger systems, things that are more critical, especially when you're talking about security. You want to make sure that all the tools that you use are functioning the way you want them to. And so, yeah, so in this process, I learned a lot about UI component testing and just how to do more front-end testing, because the front end is like the first thing that your clients will see. It's like the thing that they interact with. So you want to make sure that it's like really, really good. So when I talk about a UI component, just to kind of get everyone on the same page, it's usually a kind of a small building block that you can sort of piece together to build a larger application. So in this example, we have an open menu button that once you click on it, it opens up a set of options, and then you can click one of those options and it creates an action. And you can use this component to build something larger, something like a contact card. So we have this contact card, and this component also uses that overflow menu. So this overflow menu has now a bit more context. And in here, you click on that, and then you have different ways in which you can contact SpongeBob. And when you're talking about testing, the general question you're trying to answer is, does the UI work for the end user? So this kind of applies to any software testing. Is the thing that I'm providing, the value that I'm promising to our end users, is it actually providing that? Are they getting this value? And so kind of taking it to a granular level, when we have this overflow menu, we want to identify that you can actually open this menu and click one of the options, and then it does the action that you were expecting it to. Today I'm going to be talking to you about doing manual testing using Storybook, and automated testing using Jest and DOM testing library. All of the examples I have in this talk are React component examples, but you can apply the same principles, and the tools that I'm going to be talking about have a Vue and Angular implementation as well. So let's start talking about manual testing with Storybook. How many of you actually use Storybook at your work? Okay, so a few hands. How many of you have heard of it but don't use it quite yet? Okay. And I'm just going to assume that everyone else doesn't know what this is, so hopefully I can explain to you and get you excited about Storybook. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of what it looks like. So Storybook is a way for you to render components in isolation. And so this is a way for you to see all the components of your application outside of your application, and it gives you a very granular view on that thing that you're focusing on. So we have this contact card component, and we have different variations of it. This is a default one where the contact is offline. This is one when they're online, and it actually has a way to contact them, to start a chat. If you have their email, you can also send them an email. And then we have that overflow menu where we can have our options. And so you can render functioning components in this way. So let me go back to my page. To get started with Storybook, you would install the Storybook package that's relevant to the framework that you're using. So in this case, Storybook React. And actually, I think the version is higher now than that. And then you're going to add a npm script call it Storybook, and this will allow you to start Storybook using the start Storybook command. And when you run npm run Storybook, it will spin up a local server that you can then access on any browser on your machine, and then you can load this up, and right away it's empty. There's nothing on there. So we want to add some stories to our project. So we're going to create some stories for that overflow menu, and we're going to create a file called overflow menu.stories.js, and we've configured Storybook to look for any files in our source directory that ends in the stories.js, and it'll treat it as a storybook file. And in that file, we're going to import React and then the stories of function from that storybook package, and the components we're going to be actually rendering in our previews. Then we're going to create a stories variable and use the stories of function, and we're going to label that overflow menu. So that's the grouping of stories we're going to create. We're going to add a default story, and the second thing that we provide to the add function is a function that where you declare how you want to render your component. And so in this case, it's an overflow menu that has the open text of open menu and some options on there. And you go back to, so this is your first story, and you go back to your browser, and you have your first story under the overflow menu grouping. It's called default, and you can actually interact with this. And the nice thing about Storybook is if you have it running, it'll watch for any file changes, and so it'll refresh the page as you go. You can also add variations, like I showed you earlier. So this, we're gonna, in that same file, we can add a flipped variation of this overflow menu. It's the same component, but we added the flipped property and set that to true. And you go back to Storybook, and now we have a flipped variation story, and you can see that the menu is sort of like aligned in the opposite direction. And you can do other variations, so you can like demonstrate edge cases. So for this component, we made a design decision that we don't necessarily want a really long menu if we have lots of different options, that maybe we want to truncate that. So you can use Storybook to document all of these design decisions and also interact with it to see how it works. So this helps you manually test how all of these behaviors work. And with Storybook, because you're seeing components in isolations, you can also see variations that are maybe difficult to replicate in a real application. So we have this contact card loading variation where this is when we're still fetching some data. And so if you were to maybe load up your application, it maybe takes a couple of seconds. So you only really get to see this component for a very short period of time. But if you're working on it, you really want to have this visible and be able to iterate on it. If you're a designer, you want to look at this and verify that everything's working the way you designed it. So this is another nice thing about previewing things on Storybook. It also comes with some very useful add-ons, and I think this is what people get excited about with Storybook. So for example, we have this story, and for the SpongeBob contact card, I have on here a knobs add-on, which allows you to create basically like a quick form of all the properties that you would provide to this component, and you can change it real time. So for example, I'm going to change the title to cashier, and you can see that it changes in our component as you're typing it. And so this is very nice, and this works for text, but also for Boolean values. So if you want to switch SpongeBob to go offline, you can see that. You can also see that we have the start chat option, but if you go offline, that option goes away, and you can play around with all the different props. Additionally, there's an accessibility add-on, which is really useful. It basically runs a bunch of different accessibility tests on the things that you rendered on here, and so it'll give you information of not only like what tests failed, but also just all the tests that it ran, and you can get a lot more information about it. You can like look into the documentation about what this accessibility rule is you can even change the state of your component and then rerun your tests. This also comes with a color blindness filter. So you can change, you can add a filter and then basically preview what your component would look like to somebody who has some color blindness. And this is really useful if you're working with data visualization components where color differences is really important to convey your message. So this would be a really useful way to sort of test your color choices. And lastly, the other one I wanted to mention is called actions. And this one is, so imagine this card component. It, all it really does is it handles user inputs. And like if I wanted to start a video call, this component doesn't necessarily know how to start a video call. It just knows, okay, I'm going to call this function, and that's going to make some API calls and whatnot. So you can test these types of properties. So this component has an onVideo call property, which accepts a function. So you can test that it actually gets called when you click on that. So I click on start video call, maybe if you want to on chat. So it has all these properties, and you want to ensure that these are actually happening. And I don't have any useful information on here, but this would also show you all the arguments that are used when the function was called. So why is testing with Storybook beneficial? Well, you can render working components in isolated environment. Like we already, if you're a front-end developer, you're already kind of doing this as you go. You might be rendering this new component in your application. And so Storybook just kind of allows you to really focus on that particular component that you're working with, or like that's a set of components that you're putting together. Again, it's really nice when you're developing a new component or you're debugging an issue. Maybe you have a component that has a lot of different children, and you're trying to identify maybe where in there a bug might be happening. Again, you can preview hard to replicate UI states, so a loading state. You can just see those in Storybook. You can verify styles, animations, and interactions much more easily, and which is a little bit harder to do when you're doing just testing. And lastly, you can publish a version of Storybook in a static site on GitHub Pages or Netlify, which we definitely use. So yeah, now I'm going to talk about automated testing with Jest and DOM testing library. So I hope you're ready. I'm going to be showing you a bit of code. To get started, you'll have the Jest package. You'll be installing that, as well as two testing library packages. One is the Jest DOM, which will sort of expand the abilities of doing assertions with Jest that are specific to anything that's related to DOM elements. And then the one for React testing. So we call it React testing library. There's a Vue one. There's an Angular testing library as well. And actually, there's a bunch more. And you're going to add a test script and just run the Jest command. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing automated tests with Jest is that any UI that you're rendering is all in a simulator browser. So you're not actually seeing a browser pop up on your computer and like seeing things happen. It's just all happening on your terminal. And so it's nice because it makes things go faster, but it also requires you to have some good JavaScript knowledge. So for the first test that I want to show you is we want to ensure that when we first render this overflow menu that we don't see any of the options yet. We want to like hide this away. And so we create an overflow menu.test.js file, and Jest is already set up to find these files and run them as tests. In this file, we're going to import React. We're going to import the render function from that testing library that is for React, and the components we're going to be using in our tests. So So we're going to use the test function, that's a jest function, and we're going to describe what we're doing in our test. So we're testing that the options are not visible by default. And we're going to render this overflow menu. And when we do that, we get a bunch of different functions that we can use. One of them is query by text. So this will allow us to find a DOM element based on the text content that it has. And then we're going to do an assertion, which is basically you're testing what the actual value of rendering this component, something about rendering this component to what you expect it to be. So the first thing is we use the expect function. Inside of that, we're putting in the object that we want to make the assertion on. So in this case, we're going to find an element that has the text of option 1. And then we're going to say we're going to add in what we're expecting it to be. So in this case, what we're saying is we expect an element that has a text of option 1 to not be in the document. So that would be one of the jest tests. And when you run npm run test on your terminal, it'll run that one test and it'll pass. We already knew this. This is not exciting because we saw this in our storybook preview. So that's cool. That's good. One of the things that I wanted to point out with this test is that we use the UI labels for finding DOM elements. So a lot of times we tend to, when we're working on actual JavaScript code, we're finding elements based on a class name or some ID, some HTML attribute. But in our test, we want to simulate how a user would actually interact with your user interface. So the things that you're following is, like the labels that are actually perceivable by a user. So this would make your test a lot better and less brittle because, a class name could change, ID can change, but the labels are the things that the user is going to be able to see. So in this case, like we're using the query by text function to find an element based on its text content. You can also test state changes, and I recommend you do that. So we tested that you can, when you render that overflow menu, that you don't see the options. But what happens, now we want to test that when we do open that overflow menu, then we can see those options. So it's kind of the opposite of that. So in that same file, we're going to add another test. We're going to render our component, and now we're going to use the get by text function. It runs a little differently from query by text. I'm just going to have you look at the documentation to understand what the difference is. But essentially here, what we're saying is that we are expecting an element that has a text of option 1 to be visible. And so we go to our terminal, we run our test, and our test fails because it says that it's unable to find an element with option 1. Okay, so we did see that we had this option 1 in there, so why isn't it showing up? Well, that's because in our test, we didn't actually click on that open menu button to actually open that menu. So to fix our test, we're going to use the fire event object from React testing library. And we're going to fire a click event. You see that at the bottom on an element that has the text of open menu. So now we're clicking on that first button. And then we're going to add our assertion after that. And we run our test. And now it passes. So another thing I wanted to point out about that previous test is that we made our assertion as specific as possible. So the first test that we ran, we were checking that something was not in the document, right? So we could have easily, for this test, we could have just done the same thing of saying to be in the document, kind of the opposite of not being in the document. But we want to make each test go as far as possible, as far as we can. And so instead, I'd rather use to be visible, because to be visible already implies that the element is already in the document. So you're taking it one step further and saying, like, yes, it's in there, and a user is able to see it. Or if they're using assistive technology, that technology is going to be able to find it. So this is the power of like making a lot of assumptions within a single test. You're able to cover a lot more ground depending on the assertion that you're making. I also recommend testing component variations. So now I'm going to go to our other component, which is the contact card. And we have, similar to the actions that I showed you earlier in Storybook, if a user is online, that you should be able to start a chat with them. And so what we're saying is if we have this contact card component and it has an online, they're online, you can, and you click on Start Chat, it'll call that on-chat function. So in our new contact card test.js file, we're going to write a test, and we're going to create what's called a function mock. And a function mock is a plain function. It doesn't do a whole lot on its own. It doesn't have a return value or anything. What it does is that it keeps track of how many times it's called and what arguments were used to call that. And so we're going to create that chat mock function using just.fn, and we're going to pass that into our component through the onChat property. We're going to use the fire event as we did earlier. We're going to click on Contact SpongeBob, and then we're going to click on Start Chat. And then our assertion, we're saying that the onChat mock, which is the mock function that we created, we expect it to have been called at one time. And so Jest has different assertions related to mock functions, but I like using the calls number of times because it gives you a lot more information. So for example, if it was called 0 times, it means that that action's not actually happening, and so our component is not working. But if it's called more than one time and we only clicked on Start Chat once, that means that our component, there might be something with the logic of our component that is being a little greedy and making more API calls than you might actually intend it to. So this makes it much more specific to, like we want to call it one time if we click on it once. So the other thing I wanted to point out with this test that I just showed you is that it gives you the power of integration tests. So with this test, we not only tested the logic of the contact card, but we also kind of dove into the overflow menu logic, because we had to open that overflow menu first before we could click on Start Chat. And so the nice thing about this test is that again, you're making kind of a lot of assumptions along the way of how this component works. But you're covering a lot of ground, and because we focused our test on how a user would perceive this component, we're not using class names, we're not using IDs, which could change. We could use a totally different overflow menu component that maybe we didn't write, but because we're focusing on those labels, we can sort of you can see how this makes our test a little bit more readable and see how our users would kind of go through that flow. So why is testing with Jest beneficial? You can run hundreds of these tests in a matter of seconds. If you were to if all the tests that you wrote with Jest, if you were to do those manually, they would take a long time, and it would be very brittle, and it's just a nightmare. And we all like to code, we all like to automate things, so Jest really helps with that. It helps you interact with user interfaces like an end user, so again, using those labels, it's really nice. You can test integration between components, so again, we're not really focusing on the internals, but we're just ensuring that however we structure our component is working for our user. They don't care how we broke down our components or whatever, is that they're able to actually follow that flow that we promise that they can do. And then it also makes you a valuable developer. If you're the person on your team who's really good at testing, who really pushes to have good tests, you're going to make your team a lot more productive. You're going to have more certainty that all the code that you're writing is good, and you're going to also be kind of mentoring a lot of people along the way, which is great. So just to recap, if you're using Storybook, definitely use the add-ons. When you're writing Just test, any UI kind of test, definitely focus on the things that a user is able to perceive. Test state and prop variations, make assertions as specific as possible, make a lot of assumptions along the way, and then write more integration tests because they're going to give you a lot more value per test. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.